Hi, hello, and if you're new to the channel, welcome, and if you've been here before, welcome back. Now, if you watched my last two videos about my cruise down the Oxford Canal, you will know that I ran into some serious engine problems. Every time I reduced the revs on the engine, the oil pressure would drop and the engine would cut out, it would stall. And this is obviously a serious problem, it shouldn't be happening. In this video, I look at why the problem occurred and what I did to try and fix the problem.
Oh! Engine cut out then, that was handy.
As you can see and hear, when I have the revs on the engine, there are no problems. But as soon as I drop the revs, the oil pressure drops and then the engine would cut out. This was very annoying and of a major concern. It wasn't doing it on the early part of the cruise, it just sort of started towards the end of the first day. It was most odd. And there we go, another stall. And now I was having trouble getting it started. I was also having trouble getting the engine started, and this helped me diagnose the problem. Normally when I start the engine, I'd have it set with the engine at its sort of lowest setting on idle and the engine would start just fine. But now I had to put some revs on the engine and open up the throttle to get the engine started. So this told me that the problem was with the sort of idle speed of the engine, and clearly I needed to do something to get this fixed. I spent 45 minutes in the evening fiddling around with the engine and trying to adjust the idle speed. So how do I control the engine of the Grey Wagtail? Well, I have two controllers at the back. There is a left-hand handle and this controls the gears. Currently this is set in neutral. If I rotate this to the left, that is reversed. If I rotate it to the right, that puts me into forward gear. Engine speed is controlled via this wheel, which is on the right. If I rotate it clockwise, it increases the revs. If I rotate it anti-clockwise, it decreases the revs. The gear and throttle controls are connected to the engine via rods that run down the roof of the boatsman's cabin. And in the engine room, the gear controller turns through 90 degrees via cogs and goes down towards the gearbox. The throttle adjustment wheel connects to this strange looking device here. As you turn the wheel, what happens is the lower bar drops down and puts tension on the wire that you can just see running across the top of the picture there. So the cable is connected to this controller here, and that cable then connects down to what I call the throttle body on the engine. And on the way down to the throttle body, it passes through a number of pulleys. Here's another view of the system. Here you can see the cable passing through the first pulley. From the first pulley, the cable passes through a second pulley, which turns it through 90 degrees and sends the cable down towards the engine. And down by the engine is a third pulley which sends the cable through another 90 degrees and sends it off in the direction of the throttle body. The cable then terminates on a lever on the throttle body. So as you wind the wheel clockwise at the stern, this puts tension on the cable, pulls this lever back and therefore increases the revs of the engine. And as you wind the wheel counterclockwise, anti-clockwise, it releases the tension on the cable so the spring pulls that lever back and decreases the revs on the engine. On the throttle body are 2 screws, and my hope was that adjusting these would enable me to adjust the idle speed. However, both screws appeared to be locked solid and I couldn't move them. Hence, the only way I could see of adjusting the throttle idle speed was by lengthening or shortening the cable attached to the lever on the ceiling of the engine room. While I was tracing the cable to the throttle body, I noticed it had slipped off this pulley, and this would decrease the tension in the wire and explain why I was getting low revs at idle and the stalls. It also explained why I had to shorten the cable in my canal side fix. With the cable now correctly positioned, the engine revs at idle would now be far too high, and so I needed to readjust the tension in the cable. But at least this explained why the engine developed the problems. So, time to fix the cable. First thing I needed to do was some engine checks. I needed to check the water, the tension on the belts, and also check the oil. Checking the oil is always a bit tricky. The dipstick's sort of hidden down the side of the engine. And it all looked okay. Now, if you look very closely at the throttle thing on the ceiling of the engine room, you will see that as I take revs off the engine using the wheel at the stern, it closes. And there it closes. With the cable now correctly positioned, the idle revs were far too high at around 700 to 800 RPM, and I needed them at 500 RPM. Hence, I had to adjust the tension on the cable. To do this, I needed to simulate cruising down the canal with the engine under load and me changing engine revs. To do this, I started up the 240 volt generator and turned on the immersion heater. I then used a bike tool, a locking cable puller, normally used to adjust the brake cables on a bike, to adjust the tension on the cable. It would have been so much easier if I could have freed up the screws on the throttle body. Anyway, after much fiddling, revving and idling the engine, I got the revs to a little over 500 RPM, and at a point where taking the revs off the engine when it was under load wouldn't cause the low oil pressure warning and a stall. Success, I hope. Well, I think. Anyway, that's the story of the engine problems and how I hopefully fixed them. If you found this video interesting and entertaining, please give it a like, and if you haven't done so already, please consider subscribing to the channel, as it all helps. On the screen now you will see a QR code which you can scan, and it will take you to a free newsletter about the Grey Wagtail. There is also a link to the newsletter in the description. Thanks for watching, and until next time, bye for now.